the Saar. 220, Hindenburg and Defense Minister Werner von Blomberg threatened to impose martial law if the activities of the Saar were not curtailed. 221. Therefore, less than a year and a half after seizing power, Hitler ordered the deaths of the Saar leadership, including Röhm. After the purge of 1934, the Saar was no longer a major force. 38. Initially a small bodyguard unit under the auspices of the Saar, the Schutzstaffel, SS, Protection Squadron, grew to become one of the largest and most powerful groups in Nazi Germany. 222, led by Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler from 1929. The SS had over 250,000 members by 1938. 223, Himmler initially envisioned the SS as being an elite group of guards, Hitler's last line of defense. 224, the Waffen-SS, the military branch of the SS, evolved into a second army. It was dependent on the regular army for heavy weaponry and equipment, and most units were under tactical control of the High Command of the Armed Forces, OKW. 225, 226. By the end of 1942, the stringent selection and racial requirements that had initially been in place were no longer followed. With recruitment and conscription based only on expansion by 1943, the Waffen-SS could not longer claim to be an elite fighting force. 227, SS formations committed many war crimes against civilians and Allied servicemen. 228, from 1935 onward the SS spearheaded the persecution of Jews, who were rounded up into ghettos and concentration camps. 229, with the outbreak of World War II, the SS Einsatzgruppen units followed the army into Poland and the Soviet Union, where from 1941 to 1945 they murdered more than 2 million people, including 1.3 million Jews. 230, a third of the Einsatzgruppen members were recruited from Waffenpersonal. 231, 232, the SS Totenkopfverbände, Death's Head units, ran the concentration camps and extermination camps, where millions more were murdered. 233, 234, up to 60,000 Waffen-SS men surveyed in the camps. 235, in 1931, Himmler organized an SS intelligence service which became known as the Sicherheitsdienst, SD, Security Service, under his deputy, Heydrich. 236. This organization was tasked with locating and arresting communists and other political opponents. 237, 238. Himmler established the beginnings of a parallel economy under the auspices of the SS Economy and Administration Head Office. This holding company owned housing corporations, factories, and publishing houses. 239, 240, Economy. Reich Economics. IG Farben synthetic oil plant under construction at Buna Work, 1941. This plant was part of the complex at Auschwitz concentration camp. The most pressing economic matter the Nazis initially faced was the 30% national unemployment rate. 241, economist Jalmarskat, president of the Reichsbank and Minister of Economics, created a scheme for deficit financing in May 1933. Capital projects were paid for with the issuance of promissory notes called Mefferbills. When the notes were presented for payment, the Reichsbank printed money. Hitler and his economic team expected that the coming territorial expansion would provide the means of repaying the soaring national debt. 242, Scott's administration achieved a rapid decline in the unemployment rate, the largest of any country during the Great Depression. 241, economic recovery was uneven, with reduced hours of work and erratic availability of necessities, leading to disenchantment with the regime as early as 1934. 243. In October 1933, the Junkers Aircraft Works was expropriated. In concert with other aircraft manufacturers and under the direction of Aviation Minister Goring, production was ramped up. From a workforce of 3,200 people producing 100 units per year in 1932, the industry grew to employ 250,000 workers manufacturing over 10,000 technically advanced aircraft annually less than 10 years later. 244. An elaborate bureaucracy was created to regulate imports of raw materials and finished goods with the intent of eliminating foreign competition in the German marketplace and improving the nation's balance of payments. The Nazis encouraged the development of synthetic replacements for materials such as oil and textiles. 245. As the market was experiencing a glut and prices for petroleum were low, in 1933 the Nazi government made a profit-sharing agreement with IG Farben, guaranteeing them a 5% return on capital invested in their synthetic oil plant at Lala. Any profits in excess of that amount would be turned over to the Reich. By 1936, Farben regretted making the deal, as excess profits were by then being generated. 246. In another attempt to secure an adequate wartime supply of petroleum, Germany intimidated Romania into signing a trade agreement in March 1939. 247. Major public works projects financed with deficit spending included the construction of a network of autobahnen and providing funding for programs initiated by the previous government for housing and agricultural improvements. 248. To stimulate the construction industry, credit was offered to private businesses and subsidies were made available for home purchases and repairs. 249. On the condition wife would leave the workforce, a loan of up to 1,000 Reichsmarks could be accessed by young couples of Aryan descent who intended to marry, and the amount that had to be repaid was reduced by 25% for each child born. 250. The caveat that the woman had to remain unemployed outside the home was dropped by 1937 due to a shortage of skilled laborers. 251. Envisioning widespread car ownership as part of the new Germany, Hitler arranged for designer Ferdinand Porsche to draw up plans for the KDF Wagen strength through joy car, intended to be an automobile that everyone could afford. A prototype was displayed at the International Motor Show in Berlin on 17 February 1939. With the outbreak of World War II, the factory was converted to produce military vehicles. None were sold until after the war, when the vehicle was renamed the Volkswagen, People's Car. 252. From left, Hitler, Robert Ley, head of German Labour Front, Ferdinand Porsche, armaments manufacturer, and Hermann Göring, head of the Four-Year Plan, 1942. 6 million people were unemployed when the Nazis took power in 1933, and by 1937 there were fewer than a million. 253. This was in part due to the removal of women from the workforce. 254. Real wages dropped by 25% between 1933 and 1938. 241. After the dissolution of the trade unions in May 1933, their funds were seized and their leadership arrested. 255, including those who attempted to cooperate with the Nazis. 30. A new organization, the German Labour Front, was created and placed under Nazi Party functionary Robert Ley. 255. Many unemployed people were forcibly drafted into this organization, where they were given uniforms and tools and put to work. As a result, unemployed people disappeared from the streets, contributing to the perception that the Nazis were improving economic conditions. 256. The average work week was 43 hours in 1933. By 1939 this increased to 47 hours. 257. By early 1934, the focus shifted towards rearmament. By 1935, military expenditures accounted for 73% of the government's purchases of goods and services. 258. On the 18th of October, 1936, Hitler named Göring as plenipotentiary of the four-year plan, intended to speed up rearmament. 259. In addition to calling for therapied construction of steel mills, synthetic rubber plants, and other factories, Göring instituted wage and price controls and restricted the issuance of stock dividends. 241. Large expenditures were made on rearmament in spite of growing deficits. 260. Plans unveiled in late 1938 for massive increases to the Navy and Air Force were impossible to fulfill, as Germany lacked the finances and material resources to build the planned units, as well as the necessary fuel required to keep them running. 261. With the introduction of compulsory military service in 1935, the Reichswehr, which had been limited to 100,000 by the terms of the Versailles Treaty, expanded to 750,000 on active service at the start of World War II, with 1 million more in reserve. 262. By January 1939, unemployment was down to 301,800 and it dropped to only 77,500 by September. 263. Wartime economy and forced labor. Woman with Osterbitter badge at the IG Farben plant in Auschwitz. The Nazi war economy was a mixed economy that combined a free market with central planning. Historian Richard Overy describes it as being somewhere in between the command economy of the Soviet Union and the capitalist system of the United States. 264. In 1942, after the death of Armaments Minister Fritz Todt, Hitler appointed Albert Speer as his replacement. 265. Wartime rationing of consumer goods led to an increase in personal savings, funds which were in turn lent to the government to support the war effort. 266. By 1944, the war was consuming 75% of Germany's gross domestic product, compared to 60% in the Soviet Union and 55% in Britain. 267. Speer improved production by centralizing planning and control, reducing production of consumer goods, and using forced labor and slavery. 268. 269. The wartime economy eventually relied heavily upon the large-scale employment of slave labor. Germany imported and enslaved some 12 million people from 20 European countries to work in factories and on farms. Approximately 75% were Eastern European. 270. Many were casualties of Allied bombing. Asthay received poor air raid protection. Poor living conditions led to high rates of sickness, injury, and death as well as sabotage and criminal activity. 271. The wartime economy also relied upon large-scale robbery, initially through the state seizing the property of Jewish citizens and later by plundering the resources of occupied territories. 272. Foreign workers brought into Germany were put into 4 classifications: guest workers, military internees, civilian workers, and Eastern workers. Each group was subject to different regulations. The Nazis issued a ban on sexual relations between Germans and foreign workers. 273. 274. By 1944, over 500,000 women served as auxiliaries in the German armed forces. 275. the number of women in paid employment only increased by 271,000, 1.8%, from 1939 to 1944. 276, as the production of consumer goods had been cut back, women left those industries for employment in the workeconomy. They also took jobs formerly held by men, especially on farms and in family-owned shops. 277, very heavy strategic bombing by the Allies targeted refineries producing synthetic oil and gasoline, as well as the German